Good afternoon. I heard that automatic hush, so it sounds like it's time for us to get going. And so my name is Denise Hurd. I'm a professor in public health, but I'm also the associate director of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society. And I'd like to welcome all of you here. It's really great to see you come out, and we're just very thankful for your presence here. So today's event is co-sponsored by the Haas Institute and the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine. I want a shout out to the organizers who helped make this possible, Takia Franklin, Ericka Brown, and Deborah Lustig were very, very important for planning and organizing and helping us have this event. So to talk a little bit about why we decided that it was urgent to have an event like this now. So many of us know that forced family separation for people of color, it's not a new problem in American history. From the slave auction blocks to the children that were stolen from indigenous families and put in boarding schools, to the current crisis of the atrocious acts of separating families from their children at the U.S.-Mexico border, and a lot of other instances, both domestically and globally. This is a part of a really shameful past and unfortunately present in our country today. And I had the pleasure of speaking with one of our speakers, Professor Huggins, and she said it's an old problem, but we need to start thinking about it in new and different ways. And so I think that's what's going to happen here today. And both the mission of HIFAS and the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine is to promote, engage scholarship, activism, and policy to promote human rights, prevent health and social injury to people of color and vulnerable populations. So we felt that given the current landscape, it was very important for the university to take a stand to deal with these kinds of issues and problems, and to bring new thinking, to increase the activism and policy work to deal with this horrendous problem. So we have an incredible panel, and we have two of our professors that will be moderating that panel. So the Patricia Ben-Huina Lopez, and I didn't get her name right. She is an associate professor at the Graduate School of Education here at Berkeley, and she's a member of the Haas Institute Race, Diversity, and Educational Policy Cluster. The other moderator is Associate Professor Seth Holmes. He's in Environmental Science, Policy, and Management and Medical Anthropology. He's the co-chair of the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine and a longtime member of the Haas Institute Health Disparities Cluster. So I'm going to now turn the program over to our moderators, and we'd love to welcome you to the stage. Thank you so much.
So I have the honor of introducing two members of the panel, and then Patricia Baquedano Lopez will introduce another member. We'll say a couple words, and we'll invite the panelists up. So the first member of the panel is Haida Castañeda, who is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of South Florida. Her research and community engagement focuses on political and legal and medical anthropology, immigrant health and citizenship, especially in the United States, Mexico, and Germany. She's received the Peter K. New Award and the Council for the Anthropology of Reproduction Award, a Fulbright Faculty Award, among others. She grew up in a family between multiple borders, spending part of each year in West Germany with family members across a physical and militarized wall in East Germany, and part of each year in South Texas with family members across another border in Mexico. Her own experiences bring compassion and poignancy to her work. She's author of a forthcoming book with Stanford University Press, Borders of Belonging, Struggle and Solidarity in Mixed Status Immigrant Families, and co-editor of Unequal Coverage, The Experience of Healthcare Reform in the United States, as well as a forthcoming book with Routledge, Migrant Health, Crossing Disciplinary and Critical Perspectives, cross-disciplinary and critical perspectives. And I was lucky to be a reviewer of Borders of Belonging before it came out, and I wanted to say a little bit about it. So I think this is a brilliant, powerful, and unprecedented book. It's critical to read not only for anyone who's interested in immigration in the US and around the world, but also for anyone who cares about families, children, and parents. Castaneda skillfully portrays real families in the Rio Grande Valley who are navigating the unintended harmful consequences of immigration and social policies, displaying their deep compassion and care for one another. As they experience powerful discrimination and racism, these families display resilience and solidarity across lines of difference, actively resisting inequality in their midst. The families and individuals, immigrants and citizens, whom the reader comes to know in these pages, offer us all models for a more healthy and equal society and teach us important lessons for our communities, schools, healthcare systems, and public policies. And I happen to have a 20% off coupon that you can take a photo of for Stanford University Press. Our next member of the panel is Ericka Huggins, a human rights activist, poet, and educator. Professor Huggins is a former Black Panther Party leader and political prisoner. Her personal life experiences enable extraordinary insight on issues related to families' well-being and social change. She attended Cheney State College and studied sociology at Lincoln University. She's been professor of women and gender studies at San Francisco State University and CSU East Bay, as well as professor of sociology and African American studies at Laney College and Berkeley City College. For the past 37 years, Professor Huggins has lectured across the country and internationally on issues related to the well-being of women, children, and youth, restorative justice as an antidote to punitive justice, whole being education, and the role of spiritual practice in sustaining activism and promoting social change. She spent 14 years in the Black Panther Party, including in Los Angeles and here in Oakland, 8 of those years as director of the world-renowned Oakland Community School. In May of 1969, Bobby Seale and Ericka Huggins were targeted and arrested on conspiracy charges, sparking Free Bobby, Free Ericka rallies across the country. During her time in the Black Panther Party, she became both the first Black person and the first woman appointed to the Alameda County Board of Education. 10 years after her release from prison, Professor Huggins returned to California state, county, and federal prisons and jails to share her experiences in mindfulness. She's focused much of her work with incarcerated youth, as well as foster and adopted children and teens. In 1990, at the height of public awareness of HIV/AIDS, Professor Huggins was the first woman coordinator of the world-renowned Shanti Project, developing volunteer support for women and children of color, as well as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and questioning youth and adults living with HIV in the Tenderloin and Mission districts of San Francisco. Thank you for coming.
I'm going to introduce Angie Junck, a supervising attorney in the Immigrant Legal Resource Center based in San Francisco. With more than a decade of nonprofit experience, Counselor Junck manages several of ILRC's program areas, including those responding to immigration enforcement and immigrant youth. She helps coordinate 2 national collaboratives that address the intersection of immigration and criminal legal systems. The Defending Immigrants Project is a collaborative devoted to protecting the rights of immigrants accused of crimes by providing advocacy and support within the criminal legal system. And the Immigrant Justice Network project works to eliminate, or network works to eliminate unjust immigration penalties for immigrants and end the criminalization of immigrant communities. Counselor Junck has co-authored a number of publications, including Defending Immigrants in the 9th Circuit, the impact of crimes under California and other state laws. Another publication is Motions to Suppress, Protecting the Constitutional Rights of Immigrants in Removal Proceedings. Another one, Special Immigrant Juvenile Status and Other Immigration Options for Children and Youth, and a Guide to Juvenile Detention Reform, Non-Citizen Youth in the Juvenile Justice System. Prior to joining the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, Counselor Junck worked on post-conviction relief for immigrants and advocated on behalf of incarcerated survivors of domestic violence as the co-coordinator of Free Battered Women and a member of the Habeas Project. She is commissioner with the American Bar Association, Immigration Commission, and co-chair of the Immigration Committee of the Bar's Criminal Justice Section. She's also an advisory board member and attorney consultant with the California Coalition for Women Prisoners. Counselor Junck earned her law degree from the University of California, Hastings College of the Law. She received her undergraduate degree from the University of California at Berkeley, where she majored in rhetoric and Spanish. Go Bears. Thank you. Please welcome her.
Shall we have them come up now while we
I
say
think we should.
Why don't we have the three panelists come up and we'll say a couple words as we get ready for the panel.
Thank you. Goodness, so I want to also invite Seth to say a couple of words about your own work as we get started. First.
So I'm a physician and a medical anthropologist here on faculty in the College of Natural Resources and the Medical Anthropology program. And I've been working collaboratively with indigenous Mexican families, both in Mexico and when they've been displaced from their homes due to political and economic situations and pushed across the border into the US. And especially this past few years have been working with the youth in those families, developing a documentary film and a research project looking at the ways in which families are separated by nation-state borders and the active work they do to stay together and care for each other in the midst of that. I also wanted to bring up a couple things. As you have seen in the news, many of the topics that we're talking about today related to family separations across international borders within nation states continues today. Over 7,000 people are crossing borders and met with police force in Mexico and the threat of military and police force from the United States in caravans from Central America. And this is an urgent call for us to figure out how we're going to respond. It opens up questions for us that we need to think about today, and we have a few people to help us think through that. I also want to mention that there's been a strike this past week of workers from AFSCME, the Patient Care and Service Union in economic strike, and solidarity with UPTI, custodial staff and food service workers at the University of California. One of the things they've brought up in their research is that part of what UC has done is outsourced certain jobs to contractors who do the same work as full-time workers but without the benefits. And one of the things they brought up specifically is that the outsourced workers are by and large people of color, and that this needs to be looked at and questioned so everyone is not separated from their families without health insurance, ending up in the hospital, etc. So it's a timely moment for us to have this panel in multiple ways.
And I'm Patricia Baquedano Lopez, and I am a professor at the School of Education, and in my work I've been looking at Latinx immigrant students in schools. In my most recent work, I've been working with families of indigenous background who come from Yucatan, Mexico. I am from Yucatan, Mexico too. And these families have been displaced, and I would say for over 500 years. But most recently, because of US intervention in terms of policies and the ways in which communal land has been privatized, and so being able to sell that land to third parties and corporations that make a lot of profit from it, while leaving some of these families without home and land to work. So those numbers are growing in schools in San Francisco in particular. So this talk and the immigration issues that are happening today are also related to my work. We have been asked, and Seth already started to talk a little bit about the context for this panel, and I'm just going to say a few words about the trying to contextualize a little bit more the family separation activities that have been taking place over the past few months. We have reached in the United States a new level of violence towards immigrants. It's a type of violence that is particularly pernicious because it is using as its main target babies, toddlers, children, and families crossing the United States-Mexico border. The Trump administration enforced a zero-tolerance policy under the family separation policy, whose new guidelines were made known to the world and were violently implemented under the cover of night in April of this year. Children were separated, no, they were snatched from their parents or family members who crossed the border with them, who had accompanied them from a journey starting, many cases, from Central America's Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. How was this operation carried out? Despite being at a port of entry and at ports of entry, adults and children were separated without a spelled-out plan for reunification. Many were indigenous families, speakers of indigenous languages who were unable to be understood or made to be understood by the brutal system that was in place at detention centers. These were forced separations, the likes of which we have seen under colonial expansion. Some of that Denise mentioned, boarding schools, slavery, and other totalitarian governments of previous periods of history and current periods of history. The rationale offered by the U.S. government was to be serving in the interests of the children and to protect them from human trafficking, and that was not entirely convincing. The adults, the parents, the family members were detained and prosecuted. In many cases, they were sent to federal jails and were deported to their country of origin. The children, babies, and toddlers under the age of 5 became de facto unaccompanied and placed under the supervision of the Department of Health and Human Services, which activated a network of services to support them. We're talking about over 3,000 children who were kept in detention facilities. Some were transported, relocated to cities, bused to cities without knowing when they would see their parents again. So the world was watching, we were watching, the American Academy of Pediatrics and other professional organizations condemned the policy, pointing to the long-lasting damage, harm to these children under the separation family policy and suffering the detention center conditions that were minimally publicized in the media. So there was increasing international criticism and pressure for the U.S. to be held accountable for these acts. Cases of physical and sexual abuse began to be reported, and support groups mobilized to assist the detention centers, but it wasn't until 2 months later that the separations were stopped, and still the government stalled. Following a class action suit by the ACLU, a federal judge ordered that all of the separated children under the age of 5 be reunited with their parents within 30 days. By the end of July of this year, 1,000 and some children had been reunited with their parents, but there are still a few children that have remained in shelters and who have not been reunited yet. And we also know that some of these parents have already been deported without their children. And as Seth mentioned, the situation continues because any short-term policy, any kind of zero-tolerance policy is not taking into account the ways in which us, this country, and other countries are coalescing in a way to produce these mass journeys and people leaving their countries. And so we're hopeful and excited to hear our panelists address some of these issues. What we're going to do is that we're going to moderate with a set of questions and ask the panelists to respond to those. Seth, are we ready to start?
Yes.
Okay.
So maybe we could start with opening comments from each of you, a little bit about your own experience and work and thoughts about family separations and counteractions to those separations. Do you want to start?
Sure. All right, I'll begin. I think one theme that you'll hear today is that family separations are nothing new. I think all of us here on the panel will agree that this is a larger pattern in U.S. society, and it serves certain purposes. So I'll just, from my work, let me just highlight a couple of themes and kind of why I'm here. A couple of major themes that relate to family separation and forced removals. First of all, my work is on the U.S.-Mexico border, and historically, families have straddled that boundary. Families are not sharply separated because of a man-made boundary that in some places coincides with a geographic one. In the field side of Texas where I work, for example, the river actually serves as a natural boundary that reinforces a political boundary. But it's important to know that people have been forcibly separated on either side of that boundary going on close to 200 years at this point. And that's created many legal and economic difficulties for families. Second, working in the border region, you find quickly that there's about a 100-mile zone of exception in which certain laws that apply in the rest of the country do not apply. For example, it is much easier to search people, to ask for documents. It's much easier to quickly and under the cover of night deport people in an expedited manner. So this process has affected people along the U.S.-Mexico border in about a 100-mile strip along the border on the interior side of the U.S. They face particularly swift means of separating families because of their geographic location. Third, there's been a number of bureaucratic practices that have functioned to separate families. For example, the denial of birth certificates on a widespread basis to the US-born citizen children of undocumented parents. That's something that's been addressed in a couple of court cases, but continues in other versions to this day, for example, by denying passports to US citizens who are born of midwives in the border regions. So in these ways, you quickly are able to separate families in cases where you have heavy interior policing and immigration enforcement activities. And then finally, the regions where I work are also the same regions where, as Patricia mentioned, where newer arrivals are experiencing family separation. So that's sort of layered on top of these historical processes and experiences of family separation and forced removals that have been ongoing in those regions. So I primarily work in South Texas, but I think much of what I've said here applies to the entire US-Mexico border region. And I think I'll stop there and be happy to talk more about that as we go through the topics today.
So my name is Angie, and I work for a legal organization. We're a group of lawyers that practices what we call rebellious lawyering, and that means that we believe that our work requires us to partner with those people most impacted by systems of oppression, and that the law should be accessible to everyone. And we do not engage in traditional acts of lawyering like legal services or litigation, although we have in the past. We really do this through partnering with communities to do advocacy, education, communications, and in some ways doing a form of lawyer organizing. And through that work, we have focused on many issues, but we have decided in many of our areas is to focus on some of the hardest issues at the intersection, and those involve children impacted by child welfare systems and the juvenile justice system. It involves people that are being prosecuted at the border in federal court, and it involves people in everyday community that are found in our local jails. And so we believe that, you know, if we really want to be inclusive society, we have to fight for everyone in the immigration sphere. And so what we've been doing is really working with a number of partners around the country to look at some of the holistic reforms that we can push that really address some of the root problems of what we're seeing in family separation. And this is not a new phenomenon. It's undergirded by a lot of systems of oppression in the United States, and let alone just mass incarceration that we see. And so right now, and one of the works that we're doing is I just convened the last 2 days a group of experts and advocates and organizers that do juvenile justice work in the country that have been at the forefront of actually closing youth prisons and decriminalizing young people and addressing these issues of called like super predator. And then bringing the immigrant rights folks, the people that are litigating these cases of mass detention of youth at the border, who are serving these young people every day in detention. And to come together and really envision a different society in which we can actually look at and think about the possibility that there would not be any baby jails for any of these young people. And that we wouldn't be in a place where we would look at some of these young unaccompanied Central Americans and say they're gang members and they're not worthy of any protection of the United States. And so from taking that perspective, we're working backwards to figure out like what would those reforms look like in the next few years, even under the most difficult circumstances, and how can we work together to build some power and movement towards that. I just want to say, I guess in terms of the family separations, I won't repeat what a lot of people have heard in the media, but in terms of how we've been seeing it as people in the trenches, this is a crisis that has been manufactured by this administration. And when I say manufactured, there was a specific design by this administration to create probably such outrage on this issue to get to a reform called family detention that we rejected and organized and litigated against 10 years ago. And what was so disheartening about that was that you saw even immigrant rights centrists, Democrats and others that actually supported that idea of like, it's okay now that we could detain families together because things are so horrible right now that, you know, how could we bear less than anything else but like pulling them away. And I just want to break this down for people, what exactly is happening. People have a right to come to the border and ask for asylum. It's an international protection. It is in our federal laws. They circumvented that altogether because we know this administration does illegal things all the time. And they basically said, we will circumvent that and we will prosecute you for a federal crime. Illegal entry to the United States is one of the #1 prosecuted crime in the United States over any other federal crime, you know, weapons, drug trafficking at our border. And so by prosecuting someone, they cannot hold a parent and a child in a federal prison. It's just not legally possible. So they forcibly separated, and that's when you saw, you know, this crisis. This was done by design, obviously, to create some of the outrage to get to the reform that they wanted. But it's in some ways a brilliant strategy on their part. One, to ensure as many people as possible are deterred from coming to the United States. And two, to ensure that everyone would be locked out if there's any possibility that they could walk in and be able to stay in the United States, that they would never ever be eligible for any kind of immigration reform or release in the United States. And what they are doing is really sending a clear message to so many people that, you know, you shouldn't even try, you should self-deport yourself. And that's, you know, even though those numbers, I know people were outraged 2000, we've seen 60,000 unaccompanied minors come in 2016. We have massive numbers in the United States of people being deported. So these numbers were not significant in that way, but what the message they're sending is that they don't actually have to do much to create so much fear that people will forcibly remove themselves from the United States. And I know we'll talk a little bit about that. I do want to say though, and end on a high note, because I know we'll talk about a lot of depressing things, is I have never seen in the 15 years that I've done this work, the sustained coverage of any immigrant rights issue in the United States, period. Not even on immigration reform, not even about Dreamers. I've never seen that sustained coverage and outrage by people that I've worked with that never even said anything about immigration on social media or whatnot. And I think that that's a real opportunity for us to have a conversation about immigration, and it's been an opportunity for even some of us that are immigrant rights advocates to have a conversation with our own colleagues who have been blinded to these systems of how people have been criminalized and how we even got here. It's so bad that people are going to have to take their blinders off and really figure out, like, how did we get here and what do we really need to do differently to actually address this crisis?
Thank you.
I think that I don't quite know what to say. Thank you for what amazing work you're doing, both of you. I'm just so honored to be in your presence. And I'm sitting and I'm remembering a time when I was separated from my daughter. Is this a good time for me to share this?
Yes.
How many people here, hi everybody. How many people here are, if you came in later, my name is Ericka, have children? Okay. How many people were children? So if you can imagine for a minute being one of those babies. Pre-language baby. You're separated from your mommy. And maybe your daddy, your grandma, your siblings. What does that feel like to you? Just thinking about it, just imagining it with your real heart and your real mind. You can shout it out. I know this is usually Berkeley and you don't shout out, but come on. What? What kind specifically? What might you feel if you were 2 years old? Pain, someone said. Terrified.
Isolation.
Isolation. Scared. Sad. Inability to be consoled, just crying and crying and crying. Maybe you're 3 and your belly's hungry, but you don't eat. For any of you who are in this room who've been in that situation, I am so sorry on behalf of humanity. Can somebody give her a hug? I am just so sorry that anybody would be so violent as to take you away from your beloveds. This is real. This isn't just academic. This is a harm to humanity. And I was thinking as the both of you were talking, what if on another border, Europeans were being snatched from their babies, snatched from their mommies and daddies, maybe just even one? What would happen? Come on, y'all. World War III. I hear you. What? Outrage. Worldwide. And the kind of outrage that comes with the privilege to do something with the outrage. I don't know what to say. I'm just asking you questions so you can help me out here. When I was 19 and in the Black Panther Party, I was pregnant with my husband and I were pregnant with our daughter. And we were so delighted that we were going to have a baby. And we didn't have any money. Actually, we shared food a lot. And I got the bigger end of the deal because I was the one carrying a baby. And these were times when we were also being stalked by the FBI and routinely arrested by the police for being African American people who had the audacity to say no. Mm-hmm. No, you can't. Not anymore. Hello. And no, you can't just routinely kick in doors and take people to jail without our intervention. You can't send babies to school without feeding them first. We'll feed them. And when you step into our church basements with your guns drawn, we will ask you why and call lawyers and remove you. And so for this, we were treated like, well, I think Patrisse Cullors is writing about it in her new book. Have you heard about her book? Do you know who Patrisse Cullors is? Yes. No. She's one of the 3 original Black Lives Matter wonderful people. And her book is When They Call You a Terrorist. Mm-hmm. And so that word wasn't used for us then, but there were other words. And we were criminalized and pathologized and pretty much hated by the government. But the people we were serving were inspired by us. So there I was, a woman, a pregnant woman, a revolutionary woman, and about to birth a baby. And I'll skip over the way I was treated when I got to the county hospital. We'll skip that part. But what I want to say is that our baby daughter was born, and then within 3 weeks, my husband, John Huggins, and my dearest friend, Al Prentice Carter, were assassinated on the UCLA campus in 1969, January 1969, 2 weeks after my birthday, 3 weeks after, 3.5 weeks after my daughter's birth. And then within 2 more months, I was arrested and incarcerated. And of course, my daughter couldn't go to jail with me. And thank goodness for John's family taking her and raising her, because I had no bail. I was not allowed bail. I was isolated. I was in solitary confinement for a portion of the time I was there for 2 years. And it was the most difficult moment in my life to dry up breast milk and know from the authorities in the prison that I could not see my child more than 1 hour each Saturday. And at the border, the women and men who are parents don't even have that. But let me continue with the story, because this isn't a comparative story. The trauma that I went through being separated from my daughter cannot compare to what she went through. All of a sudden, there was literally no familiar body against hers. Can you follow this? Please stay with it. This isn't political. This is human. And when I saw her, she would look at me like, I kind of remember you. Kinda. And for a while, I didn't even want to go to see her for that 1 hour on Saturdays, because it was so heartbreaking, and I thought I would re-traumatize her by crying all the way through the hour. Well, thank goodness I had some presence of mind and taught myself to meditate. And I was able to see her for those 2 years, once a week for an hour, and not cry. I would bawl my eyes out on the way back to the cell, but I could be present with her. These families don't have that. The connectedness is gone. But what I will tell you is that my daughter and I are still repairing that time. Because though I didn't intend to be separate from her, her father didn't intend to die. She was abandoned, right? She was abandoned. The intent isn't the problem. It's the system that allows for that kind of abandonment to occur. There was no proof that there was any reason for me to be arrested. It was the times and the energies of people who, maybe some of them had children, but didn't consider any children that weren't theirs their own. It's the highest, it is still the highest expression of othering. In the United States, there are people who cannot be separated from their dogs, much less their children. I don't know what to say, except that I know that whenever there is the opportunity to vote, we need to get our butts out there. And anytime we can speak, we need to do something. We need to figure out what it is that we can say and do, not just what it is we can listen to or read or ask questions about. What is it that we can do to uplift our world? Because this is a heinous expression of harm. And it's been going on and going on and going on. And so my daughter and I are now able to talk about how it felt for her. We talk about it often. She has children now. And I wish that I could turn back all clocks and take that out of her life, and of course my own. But it's not possible. But we are in this time right now where there is something we can do. I don't know what you can do. I know what I do. So I'm going to stop there. And I'm going to keep asking myself what I can do. And I'm going to answer that question. And I hope that you will too.
Thank you, Professor Huggins. This is really, it's an important meditation on the crisis of humanity that we need to sit with today and in everyday work. I want to, think a little bit broader, and you brought us to this moment to think of the family separation or the damage to humanity that is beyond the border that we're talking about earlier today. Recently, the New York Times had a story that was brought to them by one of the ACLU attorneys, and the story of a woman that was referred to as Miss L, who was from the Republic of Congo, but who was detained also at the border as she was seeking asylum and was separated from her 7-year-old daughter. And so we focused on the border, thinking the Mexican border, the Central American immigrants that are fleeing violence in their country. But this is about families everywhere. This is about the human condition that is leaving, that is forcing people to leave what they know as home in search of a different type of belonging. And so I wanted to ask the panelists, why are things, affecting so many people, and how in their work have they seen the situation of family separation impacting broader communities? African, Caribbean, Muslim, Asian, Pacific Islander, Mexican, as well as Central American. What connects these separation dots, if we can imagine that? What makes these experiences similar and connected? And what has been done about it beyond what we immediately focus on at the border? Or what can be done?
And what is being done already,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, I'll start and set it up for you. So I think one thing to recognize is that there's an intersection between our immigration law systems and immigration enforcement and our criminal systems. And I think that's what connects a lot of what we're talking about on the panel here today. And so one of the ways in which these systems are connected are, first of all, through increases in interior immigration enforcement that is capturing a lot more families up into the nexus of those two systems, regardless of where they're from. And I guess sort of as a thought experiment, the thing I'm going to sort of point out is that a lot of this goes back to a concept that's called best interest of the child. And the concept of best interest of the child is something that spans not just immigration, but all sectors of our society and disproportionately impacts communities of color, communities living in poverty, communities living in marginalized regional areas of our country. And this is where I'm going to kind of transition to Angie, but is that the concept of best interest is a discretionary one, right? So when a family is caught up in either incarceration, detention, deportation, there's a calculation made about children living in the family and what would be in their best interest. And a child's best interest is being determined in these cases by bureaucrats who can essentially lay out that definition and the various concerns associated with it in any way that they want, right? There's very few guidelines often. And this is particularly how some of the most marginalized communities get caught up in this system in cases where children are removed from families, for example, and put up for adoption. The best interest clause was used among American Indian communities to support residential schooling and separating families in that way and having children for very long periods of time being educated outside of their communities. And so we have a history in this country of thinking about this concept, this bureaucratically ambiguous concept of what's in the best interest of a child or a minor or a vulnerable person in a family, and that has consistently supported family separations of various types in the United States. And so one of the ways in which this happens, to go back to your question, is that immigrant families of all types are caught up in this nexus and often face types of separation because of that.
When the family separation crisis happened, something that really stood out to me was I had a friend that posted a picture of a jail on Instagram. And what he wrote was, there's already a 10,000 bed detention facility in downtown Houston that police use to separate families. The people who control the facility have consistently been faulted for breaking the law and engaging in discrimination. And this is the Harris County Jail. It's one of the largest jails in the country. It deports more people than any other jail, thousands of people each year. And it affects this county is terrorizing communities of color. It's not just immigrants. And I think that's the hardest thing about some of these issues in immigrant rights is that people see something on the border and see it as everything, and this is happening in our backyard every day. It's called the Alameda County Jail, Santa Rita. Every single day, that sheriff works with ICE to report people, to deport people from this county, to separate them from their families. And those are the stories of separation that we hear every day. And I think a lot of this, I mean, because we have the numbers, has been painted as a Mexican, Central American issue, but we have so many other communities impacted. We have some of the largest undocumented API communities in the Bay Area. Do you know that the Black immigrant community is more disproportionately affected by deportation detention than any other immigrant of color in the United States? And so I want to just share a couple of examples of what this could look like in the stories that we hear every day. Family separation is a Southeast Asian refugee who was induced to come to the United States at a young age through a refugee resettlement program, landed in poverty in a crime-ridden community with little to no resources, and as a means of survival, found themselves on the street with gang members and ended up being criminalized and did their time, but now is being mandatorily deported to a country that they never lived in. These are people that are born in refugee camps, end up in the United States, think that they are American because they never became citizens because they didn't understand that process because no one educated them here in the United States that if you become a refugee, you should become a citizen. Here are some of the responsibilities. And now you're deporting them. And we have some of the largest diaspora now in Asian countries as a result of that. And it's just the Black immigrants every single day who are subject to constant police surveillance on the street. And you take this phenomenon of mass incarceration and you feed it into mass deportation, right? I mean, they're designed to work together so that, you know, it's not enough that you do your time, but that you continue to suffer the consequences of those actions. And there are many consequences in the United States when you're a formerly incarcerated person.
But for immigrants, it's actual banishment from the United States, for which you could be prosecuted for a federal crime if you come back to reunify with your children and your family. And so these are the kinds of stories that we hear every day, and I think just my offering to this group is just to really be aware. These are people that are in our community every single day. They're not just the stories that we hear on the news media. And there are a lot of systems that are complicit in this. It's not just a federal immigration system. It's not completely out of our power. There are local systems every day that are effectuating harm on our local communities.
Do you have anything you want to add?
I wonder if we could dialogue. I mean, otherwise,
Sure.
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah. We had planned that for
Could I
later,
ask-
but I think this is the moment.
Could I ask a question while mics are getting
right,
out?
and I wanted to thank both of you for what you just said. And particularly, I want to thank you for broadening that which is the continual repetition of the one story, you know, which further pathologizes Central American people. They become the enemy because we can't see that this is a systemic, structural form of racism. It is. So I wanted to thank you for that and the facts that you just gave. Did you appreciate having those facts? Did you know that? Some people did, some didn't. So thank you. So quiet in here, huh?
Thanks to all of the panelists. So I work within an organization that is trying to move towards greater justice in adoption. And so the best interest of the child is something I'm very familiar with. And I've often thought that we could make some progress if we shifted that concept to the best interest of the family. Because the moment that you isolate the child outside of the context of its family, you commodify the child, you allow other people to be making choices and decisions for that child. But it almost feels like heresy because our child welfare system is so rooted in that concept to suggest that perhaps what needs to be elevated is the best interest of the family. And I just wonder if you could share some thoughts about that.
I'll say that I agree with you, that you know, one of the ways in which we can effectively single out and produce violence on families is by singling out individuals as the locus of intervention, right? If we think of people as existing within families and within larger communities, that's much harder to do. And so the law and a lot of our policies and a lot of our processes are very adept at singling out individuals and doing exactly the kind of harm that I think we're talking about here today. So I agree with you that I think it needs to be a larger consideration of the best interests of the family or even the best interests of a community. I think that focusing on the individual is precisely a way in which we hide some of these larger effects.
I just want to say, I guess, like in doing immigrant rights work, we don't even really talk about the best interests of children. That's how far behind we are. And when we talk about systems. I mean, the things that we're able to do to immigrant children in this country, if you understood even the rules and laws, or actually the lack of rules and laws of what they can do and act. I work with a lot of people that work in child welfare and youth justice, and they're like, how could this even be? These are rejected models from like decades ago. Like, how can we use congregate care and hold 2,000 kids in a single facility and not expect that these kids will be sexually, physically abused. It's a guaranteed result when you put young people in those situations. And so for us, I mean, I think there is a lot of learning to be done about what are those models? What would that look like? Because we're fighting at this point for even some young people to get out of these local, they snatch and make kids disappear that are in our local communities. And I just want to say just one of the biggest thing that's the issue that we've been focusing is on these unaccompanied minors, young people that they basically other by labeling them gang members, saying they are wolves in sheep's clothing, that the gangs are killing all our communities and create such fear that any kind of child standard goes out the window. You literally snatch them from their homes where they're at, and the federal government already knows where they're at because they've already arrested them and released them. And then you put them in a detention center and their parents don't even know where they're at. And then you tell them you don't even get a hearing to even see whether or not you're going to be released. And then they tell you after that, whatever someone said that you're a gang member or not, it's done. You can't disprove anything that anyone said, even if it was a lie. And so for us, if they're willing to treat children this way, it's like we have a long road to go to figuring out how do we get people to even care about some of these young people and not see them literally like we dealt with in passages like Super Predator, that these young people are monsters.
If I could add to that, sort of bridging these two points, I was just 2 weeks ago, actually 2.5 weeks ago, I was down at the border and met a little girl who had just been released from detention, and her name is Helen, and she's 5 years old. She entered the United States with her grandmother, and she was persuaded to sign away her rights, right? Maybe you've heard of this case. She's 5 years old, 5 years old. That just sort of speaks to how far behind immigrant proceedings are in understanding the rights and also the capabilities of children. This went pretty much unquestioned until a nonprofit got involved and pro bono lawyers got involved with Helen's case and eventually persuaded her to be released back to her grandmother's custody. This is 2.5 months after she was detained and put in a facility with other children by herself, away from her family. And I was there when she was released, and they had this big party at the organization that helped with her release. And it was a really bizarre mix of emotions because she was given all these, it was almost like a birthday party, right? A princess birthday party. She was given this little princess dress, and there's a cake, and there was welcoming her, but Helen was silent.
Yes.
Helen was silent. She's dressed up in this pink princess dress with everyone feting her, celebrating her. Helen's silent, and her mother is there and says, she's not the same. She's not the same. But that a 5-year-old could be legally given paperwork to sign away her rights should be astounding, should be shocking, should be, widely seen as an act of violence on a child and on families, family integrity.
One concern I have with best interest of family partially comes from my experience as a physician working at Highland Hospital. I've done a fair amount of my work at Highland in palliative care. I've done other work in the Human Rights Clinic and urgent care, but in palliative care, I've taken care of many people who are gay or transgender or lesbian or queer, who have been separated from their families, by heteronormativity, homophobia, gender normativity, and I've seen people die without anyone visiting them, or with people visiting them and shaming them, and treating them as undeserving. And I would be nervous, and also as a queer person myself, I'm lucky to have parents who I have a good relationship with after several years of not having a good relationship. And I see my queer friends see my relationship with my parents when my parents come to visit, and they both become sad because they don't have a relationship with their parents, the vast majority of my queer community. or they want to hang out with my parents and me for some kind of like, whatever you would say, like vicarious
Love.
therapeutic experience. And in both those situations, I would be nervous about the best interests of the family. I don't know what it should be. Best interests of community, best interests of humanity, environment, I don't know. But that, if family is, when everything is within structures that are systematically and structurally violent, differently to everyone, but in different ways, systematically, especially to immigrants, people of color. In our kind of preparation, we talked about the Japanese American internment. We talked about the Bracero program that separated men from families. We talked about the American Indian boarding schools, chattel slavery, Jim Crow laws that led to great migration of African Americans. But I'm also thinking about family separations, being a physician and being a member of a queer community as one of my communities. So, yeah.
I thought that the conversation was, you have the microphone? Okay, just 1 second. I thank you for that. And do you need a tissue?
I could use one, but I'm okay.
Okay. But I thought that
Here's my shirt.
you know, the conversation about the best interest of the child. Oh, here comes tissue Takia. And I thought that the best interest conversation was about reframing the language, not deciding on,
Yeah.
you know? And it's like, sometimes just putting it out there like you did and we're doing now is great because structurally it's all rotten. And that's the thing to remember. And that isn't to say that people are rotten. I'm saying if an infrastructure is ready to be demolished and we just put up a new wall, that's not getting at it. It's structurally, let's say, corrupt. And if not corrupt, then old, very old. And you were talking about this. And we need to look at it all in new ways, including challenging those who hold the old ways as the way to move forward, like in the institutions, the institutionalized organizations that we might work in. And so I just wanted to say that. Sorry you've had your hand up for a long time.
Yeah, not to backtrack or anything, but I guess I just needed a little bit of clarity because I was a little bit confused as to something that you were saying. I'm sorry, I missed your name, but you were mentioning how 5-year-old kids are being given papers to forego their rights, and you were saying how that's legal, and I just wasn't aware that that was legal for the government to be able to give a 5-year-old who does not have their parents with them make those kinds of like decisions. And in a way, would you say that that is also a trap that the government is trying to give kids so that they forego, you know, is this all part of the system's goal to, you know, basically like erase these people from our country?
Yeah, I think you said it well. It's the system's goal to erase people. And this is one of many instances of that, or to other people, or to assume that they have, you know, that a 5-year-old has capabilities in one situation but not in others. Most people also don't know that during deportation proceedings, a 2-year-old can represent themselves. In fact, they are forced to represent themselves because, unlike in criminal cases where you have an attorney, or if you can't afford one, one will be provided to you, that does not apply in immigration proceedings. And so if you were a 2-year-old, let alone a 5-year-old, I think even 6-month-old children have sat before an immigration judge. So pre-verbal children representing themselves. So yeah, it's holding the rights of individuals, in this case immigrant children, as not equal to that of other children, not equal to that of other citizens or residents of this country. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's shocking, but I think a lot of people don't even realize that when you're being deported, you don't have a right to an attorney, including if you're pre-verbal.
Someone here has a mic.
I am really grateful and honored that you're here
Think
and
about it.
capable of hearing the information that you're sharing with us today. My question is, what do I say to my friends, my neighbors, and my loved ones in my family when I bring this conversation up and we watch the evening news and we watch the people who are on their way here to the United States? What do I say to them to help them understand that these people that are coming, they're not bad, they're not going to hurt us? How can I explain to them that this is something that the United States did that causes them to come here? How can I articulate that in a way that they will understand it? And I think that we all are grateful. I'm speaking for myself, but I think we all are grateful to hear the information that you're sharing with us today so we get a better understanding of it. Can you help us, please?
Yeah, I mean, these are difficult conversations we have all the time, but I mean, honestly, a lot of this is sometimes the human contact and sharing the stories and the people that are the most compassionate are the people that actually meet some of these individuals, to know that they're not someone that's scary over there, the other, right? And that there's similar strands in these stories. And in some ways, too, I connect the dots about how this country has punished, controlled so many different populations, and it's been a cycle of violence. And now a lot of what we're seeing with the immigrant community are tactics that we have seen on the war on drugs and the war on people. They are the same tactics that have been played and twisted to some extent, and then exerted on immigrants. And a lot of what we do is try to build solidarity and understand. And I think one of the things that's really hard for people to identify is when you say what you don't want, people are like, well, I'm not affected by that. Why should I care? But why aren't we having a conversation about what we all do want? And the reality is at the local level and things, there's so many people in power are using their money and their resources to divide us instead of for us to unify ourselves and really figure out, like, we all want to be safe, we want to thrive. How do we not see this kind of as a scarcity? And it takes a while to get there, and I know a lot of groups have taken a long time to have those dialogues in those communities and build that solidarity. But the more that we can share and talk about it, what we do want, what we want to live, what kind of society we want to live in, I think we get closer to that than saying, here's the problems with all of this, and say, well, it doesn't affect me every day. So.
I wanted to comment on recognizing the victories and our resistance along the way. Freedom for Immigrants, which serves immigrants in jail and in detention, has been working for 7 years at these issues. And they and other activist groups and the people of Richmond rose up and kept a vigil every Sunday for a long, long time to get ICE out of the Alameda County detention facility. I think that's a tremendous victory. Sadly, of course, there's always consequences. They now sent those people farther from their families to Yuba City or I forget the Mesa Verde. But I want to invite students to participate in helping to meet with those immigrants in jails and in their detention facilities in Yuba City and Mesa Verde, and particularly Spanish-speaking students, and be able to provide that solidarity. It means so much, I believe, for an individual to care, simply come and care with someone and for them when you're isolated from your family. So that can be checked out online, Freedom for Immigrants. It used to be called Civic.
Thank you.
And I volunteer with them.
Thank you so much for sharing your stories and your work. I was just hoping to add another layer of family separation, that of the Muslim ban, and maybe you all on the panel could speak a little bit to that. I've been in Oakland schools and have sat with young Yemeni children whose parents can't come. And, you know, Al Jazeera has done a really brilliant report on U.S. Yemeni American citizens in Djibouti trying to get their children or their wives, you know, into the U.S. to be with them, the civil war, but because of the ban, you know, not being able to. And so that is also another layer of family separation that I think we often leave out. And so I wondered if anybody wanted to speak to that, and also just really appreciative of the panel in general. So thank you.
Thank you. You want to comment?
So I have a question. Can you hold for one moment? Did anyone want to respond to?
I mean, I would just acknowledge that it's absolutely true, and a lot of the narrative has been driven, like post 9/11. I mean, we are in the state that we are because of, you know, the fear of terrorism and national security, and people that are Muslim face the greatest barriers in the immigration system, because when you just say that word, it triggers all sorts of procedures that you actually don't even know what is happening to these communities. We, as advocates, don't even have access to half that information. And a lot of, I think, what people talk about immigrant rights is just how surveillance has been driven in this country and sharing. And we don't even know half of the things that are happening right now that we need to get ahead of at the local level. So I think that's something that people are trying to address, but it's been really incredibly hard, because it's that one thing that everyone's like, we're willing to give up for immigration reform. We can't touch, because everyone agrees, right, that we can't, you know, stand up for those issues.
And it's even been a part of Trump's statement that he is planning to, I don't think he has yet, issue an executive order to engage the military to stop the caravan, stating that there are Middle Easterners and terrorists hiding among them. So even in the current caravan coming through Mexico, that other level of othering is being used to legitimize violence against multiple groups of people.
I just want to also comment on the ways we're talking about structural violence, the way in which our laws and our policies look like they're fair, that they're there to protect, right? But that at the core, they're also fundamental policies of racial violence. And that, you know, like what we're, you know, what you just mentioned, Angie, in terms of like, this doesn't relate to me and that is someone else's problem, because we can be, and this is in fact what people say, right? It's like family members say that. It's that we're, you know, we have been so supported by these policies and you know, the benefits that you can derive, you know, if you belong to a class that isn't, or a race that isn't the target of these violent structures that we have, is that you can feel separated, but when in fact it is because we are so related, right? The benefit of some is the curse of others, right? And you know, those who benefit, you know, are, you know, not the targets of racial aggression, right? So like, this is so deeply ingrained that we can, through these laws and mechanisms, feel like we are not related, right? When in fact we are so part of the process that racializes and rejects.
I am so glad you said that. I really, when you asked your question about how we can have these conversations with our family and friends, because I can't not do that. I have to have conversations, otherwise it makes me sick, physically sick. If I'm holding something that is a truth, I don't mean I want to blowtorch somebody. I just mean I want to say what's on my heart. When you said that, I wasn't going to say this, but now I will. We still have in the law of these United States, in property law, vestiges of the owning of humans, like your family and my family. What does that mean? That means that a lot of things are okayed throughout history, and that the ways in which we've been spoken to about what is real and what is not, what is the truth and what is a lie, are all merged and mixed and crazy. Especially when you think of what internalized racism does. And once we get confident enough to believe, well, not me anymore, I mean, my people have, and then one day, your grandson is in a car and gets pulled over. What then? Having done nothing. So the conversation is about the ways in which the structural racism impacts our individual lives, our families' lives. We were talking earlier, I think I was talking to you about this book called Lose Your Mother. You should read, this book is beautiful. It's difficult, but it's a beautiful book. It's about the mid-Atlantic slave trade. And, but we were talking about how African people were stolen. The children were stolen. There are all these other narratives about what happened, but they were stolen. Just picked up and carted and put in that castle in Ghana, and we know the rest of that history. Or if we don't, we should. And now we have textbooks for children that say African American people came here as migrant workers. Textbooks. Yes. If we don't tell our story, somebody else will, and somebody else is. And we're believing it. And then we're othering, here we are, the unwilling immigrants, let's call ourselves, for lack of a better way to describe it, othering immigrants because we believed a fictitious narrative. That doesn't mean we shouldn't feel safe and brave and confident in the life that we have, but we just have to understand there's some holes in the narrative. So thank you again, and thank you for that beautiful question. Thank you very much. And good luck with your conversations.
So I have a question about adolescents in particular. I'm a pediatric nurse practitioner. I work primarily with immigrant youth and unaccompanied youth, and I also do research. And in really talking to the young people I work with, many of them have made the journey from Central America because they were they were given a choice of basically being recruited by the gang or dying. And every one of them had stories of cousins and brothers and sisters who had actually been murdered. So I think of them as a protected class in a way, that they have actually been targeted because of their age, because of their status as youth when they come here and they're being demonized. And I'm wondering your thoughts on how to shift that conversation about them.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand your question.
So, I mean, I see that adolescents coming from Central America basically are protected class in terms of asylum because they have been so targeted by gang violence, and many of the youth I've spoken to have actually been directly threatened or have seen family members of their same age murdered. And when they come here, the story is that they could be the gang member themselves, and that doesn't seem to be a legitimate reason to ask for asylum. And I'm wondering how to try to shift the conversation, particularly about the whole large group of youth who come.
I mean, I think the question you're asking is fundamentally what immigration is about, is who is American, who belongs, and who doesn't. And this idea that the United States wants to pick and choose who is an ideal immigrant to stay, right? I mean, the imagery itself in immigration reform has painted these pictures of someone in a jumpsuit gang member and the other person as a valedictorian or graduate, right? Of who we should protect or not. And so I think until we fundamentally break that down, and I think language really matters. I hear it all the time from people saying, but they're not criminals. They're not doing this. Like, no, the federal government already defined them as criminals. That's why they're prosecuting them. They are criminalizing behavior all the time. Until we kind of get at the root of that, I think we'll continue to be in these difficult places in which we're fighting legal battles of like, no, the law says that it should protect, X, Y, Z, and we're trying to force these arguments of what international protection looks like, or just having this debate about what, United States responsibility, right, in intervening in other countries like Central America. We exported a gang problem that has been created the most dangerous places in the world, right? But no one wants to talk about it. It's like, no, that's their problem. They should deal with it. And that everything else in the United States is based on personal behavioral choice. They're choosing to come here to violate the law without understanding that larger context. So I don't know if I have the answer to you, because that's the struggle of the immigrant rights movement. That is what fundamentally we are trying to do while we're defending these attacks and in the trenches every day, but needing to take a step back and understand, like looking at that rotten structure of like, how do we start tearing pieces of this down at the same time?
I would add to that, using the rhetoric of gang member is good enough to strike fear in the hearts of Americans, but it's not a good enough reason to apply for asylum these days. You maybe recall that Attorney General Sessions recently said that threats of gang violence and experiences of domestic abuse and interpersonal violence are no longer grounds for asylum. Yeah. So in this case, what's good for the goose is not good for the gander. It strikes fear in one population, but it's not good enough for a reason for asylum. And it's just another example of these othering tactics, along with, I think we mentioned earlier, talking about trafficking, referring to the parents of children along the migrant caravans and so forth as traffickers, as trafficking their children. So I think it's just another example of that.
And it's important to look at colonialism in all of this, which America has had its hand in the blow. But why do people want to leave a place? Because of systemic poverty. And crime is an expression of poverty. There's so many ways to look at it. It's like turning a prism. So you see how the light's reflected and refracted every different kind of way. So no matter which way you look at it, we have an obligation, we who call ourselves Americans, and I do, we have an obligation to humanity. These are not, the poor choices thing is really one of, just gets me going. But we have done such a thing in the world under the guise of reestablishing democracy. So yeah, it's a new way of thinking about the world we live in, and that this United States is not the center of the world. Not the center of the world. So yeah, thank you for your question.
So we have 2 more questions in the audience before we turn it back over to the moderators for the final comments and questions from the panelists. Okay. First one here.
Hi. So this is kind of going back to what Angie was saying in the last question. And it's a little bit more to do with immigration policy, if that's okay. I think that the United States has intervened in foreign aid and policy in the name of corporate interests at the expense of a lot of poorer countries, resulting in a lot of mass immigration. And I was wondering, in terms of this, how legal and how necessary and ethical do you think immigration quotas are? And then also, Sorry, I'm really nervous. And then also, what kind of foreign policies do we need to change in order to affect undocumented immigration flow?
I can just say something about the quotas so people know that there are designated numbers of visas that are allocated to certain countries to be able to come to the United States. At one point, you know, there were more very generous quotas for different countries to come to the United States, and they decided to change that, and it was basically, I would definitely say it's race-based. You take certain countries that would have the greatest impact, like Mexico, and you give them a very disproportionate amount, where you give white countries in Europe a greater amount. And then you create this concept of illegality of like, they didn't actually follow the law. They didn't get in line, right? They don't deserve to be here. And the line looks like if I had a brother and I'm a US citizen, 30 years to immigrate to the United States. Tell me if that's doable and realistic to reunify with your family member. And so that's the problem, the quotas. And unfortunately, people are always talking about undocumented status, but like that is that threat too. The threat of people being able to reunify with their families in the United States is not possible right now. And you have Trump and this administration talking about, you know, chain migration. We shouldn't value people based on like our family, right? We actually should value them for their merit. What are they contributing to this country? What kind of work value, economic value? And that's a conversation in immigration that's always come. You're more generous in the United States when you like see a certain benefit from migrant workers that come here to do our labor. And then when you have no need for them and there's economic recession, you want to blame them for being here. So I think that's something that to keep your eye out, because we've been trying to work on that. And I think there's some very slippery slope kind of rhetoric that's been used. And we just did actual with Color of Change, a whole petition on this use of chain migration. The news media outlets had not used that word ever. And all of a sudden, like it was 30-fold use of that word. They took, and again, language matters. That's right. It creates this chain reaction of how people think about these issues. I mean, turn 4 and 8, I don't know if Heidi has them. I mean, these are the things that we continually want to talk to. Like when we talk about the crisis in Central America, we can't address this gang crisis and what's happening to young people here in the United States without looking at an international issue. But it's a very hard thing to do based on the lack of resources in the home country and the support systems that don't exist. And the fact that a lot of people don't want to talk about this as an international issue, right? I mean, they're very dismissive of international law and those protections that are needed.
I'll just add a resource for you just to underscore what you're talking about. If you type in, you just Google State Department Visa Bulletin October 2018, you can see the numbers of what visas they're currently processing right now. And you'll see that, for example, for a family-based visa, talking of visa quotas, there's 4 countries that are disproportionately affected, and that is Mexico, the Philippines, India, and China. And to the point you were just making, if you have an adult brother living in Mexico right now and you're petitioning to bring them over, they're currently processing paperwork that was filed on the 25th of June, 1995. Right, so she said this, but I just want you to have a resource to go look up and to share with people you know, so that you can see why people might, after 23 years, decide to take another route into this country. Not that I would endorse that, but you can see that there's an unmanageable line here, and it's all based on these visa quotas, these visa oversubscribed categories of visas that people don't really know about, and they don't realize that there's different countries affected in different ways. Right, bringing your brother over from Norway would be quite easy.
Mm-hmm.
Yay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I spent most of my life in prison, so technology is still a little foreign to me. First of all, thank you guys, of course, for taking the time to come and share. I'm humbled to be able to hear from you all. I was wondering, it was mentioned a little bit around gangs and, for example, young people not getting the right to representation that you get in criminal court. And maybe if you can go a little further with this idea that and this might help some folks in their conversations with their loved ones of, like, I don't want the gang members here, but I'm okay with the good kids, I just don't want the bad kids, right? And that very problematic narrative where if you come here and you're just pulled over because you're a Latino walking down the street in a community that's oversaturated with police, and you haven't done anything wrong, and you've never had police contact before, and you've never been arrested, and you're doing well in school, et cetera, immigration can still show up to your house, oftentimes does 2 days later, and say you're a gang member, and then it's on you to have to prove how you're not a gang member, right? With very limited understanding of how systems and structures in this country work, not necessarily understanding this notion of gang member as it applies in the United States, so really not very well equipped to challenge a label that you don't fully understand, but also while you're locked up, right? Like you're in detention, you don't have the resources, and how they're shifting folks across country and whatnot to try to leverage that idea of sign away your asylum opportunity, sign away and just go. And so when we hear gang member, overwhelmingly majority of the time from my experience, you're not hearing of somebody that's ever committed a violent crime that is anything like what we think of.
I just want to say, so I know Josh for a long time. He's a teacher and mentor for me. He is one of the only people that I've been able to find that would be a gang expert in these cases of unaccompanied minor youth that are being accused of being in gangs or being deported. And so he's gone as far as to Boston, New York City, to testify in cases where these young people have no resources. They don't have the money for experts. And he goes against the federal government, local law enforcement that are claiming these young people are gangs and discredits them because he understands what, the problems are with gang databases. Us in immigrant rights, we've learned from people like Josh, but trying to fight that is an uphill battle, and he's been a great resource and tool for us. So.
Part of what I'm grateful for today is the mix that each of you have brought of a structural analysis of the system and how it's sick, and the personal stories from your own life and other people's lives about how it affects us on a personal, interpersonal, emotional, psychic, bodily level. And I wonder if you could each tell one story of one person or a collective who's doing something to change things, doing something towards social change, structural change, whatever it might be. I mean, you already told you're doing that. You are that story. And I think, Angie, you just did that by telling us about what Josh has been doing, which kind of helped me think that that might be helpful. People have asked about what they can do, and I wonder if hearing a story of what someone or some people have done or are doing might be helpful.
First of all, thank you for the work you're doing. I think people's time and expertise and investment in trying to change things is really key. I mentioned the organization that helped with Helen's release, right? That's a lot of volunteers coming together and feeling the power of strength in numbers was really key in that situation, right? It's not just one lawyer doing something, but a whole community behind them. But the story, I guess, that I would tell is that this current migrant caravan, which I have a little problem with that term. I mean, in Spanish it works quite well. That is the term people use, but for the American public, it's not one of those catchphrases, just like a chain migration, right? It starts to take on this life of its own and becomes a boogeyman of some sort, but that's not what we want to do with that. And I think what's going on with the with the migrant caravan is that, maybe we should be reframing it as asylum seekers on a journey, right? That's really what it is. It's not a caravan, a scary caravan coming north to us. So I happen to know that there are many people on the ground. You may have recently heard that this group has swelled in size from 2,000 to 5,000 to 7,000 people.
I want you to know that those are not all people who are migrants necessarily in that caravan. I want you to know that there are a lot of advocates, there are activists, there are people bringing their organizations. I know people who are professionals from Tegucigalpa in Honduras who have traveled north to join this movement of people. I know that there are people who are Mexican nationals who live in the communities that these people are passing through, who are just joining in and supporting them. And if you look closely at the pictures, you'll see that it's a mixture of people. The numbers are swelling not because more and more migrants are joining and marching northwards. They're swelling because there are activists, there are advocates, there are organizations who are traveling to meet them and join them. So know that, and that will be my story, really, of collective action and the impact of people are stronger together.
I've been fortunate to work with a lot of different groups, organizations, and a lot of them are undocumented youth themselves. I mean, the power that they have to change is just phenomenal, and the ideas that they have taught me so much. But I'll just tell the story about how I even got into this work and where I really believe that a lot is possible. I worked and volunteer with the organization, and there's another person in the audience, Hamdia here, works with me, the California Coalition of Women Prisoners, and working with women that have isolated, incarcerated survivors of domestic violence, visiting them inside prison and really fighting for their freedom to be able to retell their stories and be able to be heard in court so that they can get released. And we've worked with many women, and one woman in the early 2000s was one of the first to be granted parole, one of, I think, around 3 people to be granted parole by then Governor Gray Davis. And it was like a tremendous victory for people to get to that. But to find out that, we were blindsided the fact that she was going to be deported after she had been sex trafficked by her abuser, served 25 years to life in sentence. And what was inspirational about that experience is that the family, we're like, no, we will not accept this. We will organize, we will do everything we can to humanize her story, to push on every single person, and we know people's power, right? We're gonna look at our elected officials, we're gonna look at our congressperson, we're going to use the media, we're gonna use Spanish media, English media. They used every single resource to organize. And the result of that, I mean, it's not always a result of this, but they got basically a pardon for a person that served 25 years to life in early 2000s to be able to stay in the United States. And if we can do things like that, it's tremendous to me, like that power in organizing a new family and coming together. And that gives me hope that I think that we can do a lot.
I don't really have a story I can share.
I find this incredibly powerful because your presence is a story that lives, and it teaches us so much about, just not just resilience, but rising above and inviting us to also be active in changing the way we are. Thank you for your presence. I want to just comment, I know we're winding this down, and to return to your question to us at the beginning of this conversation, we just imagine ourselves as children and to think about babies and children. And for me, one takeaway point as a professor in education who examines and thinks about childhood and children and babies, how we continue to manipulate this category, the social category of children. And we have done this to some of the most vulnerable. Children are powerful and agents and all those things because we have seen that, the terrible twos, right? But children truly, in the hands of a structure that's racist and that others and rejects are truly vulnerable to what adults decide about them. And so, to think about family, but to think about those children being manipulated, I wonder how this is going to change the way I talk about our relationship to students and children in schools, and relationship to children and babies and families. And I hope that it changes for a different kind of understanding and positioning of children and families, but also our own responsibility towards them.
In closing, if there's anything else that anyone wants to say or invite or ask, I welcome that. We welcome that. I also want to let you here know that the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society, with the help of Takia Franklin and Ericka Brown, especially put together a resource and action sheet, which of course is incomplete in all kinds of ways, like many things are, but there are lists of things going on campus, there are lists of community organizations, etc., that might be things you want to support or learn from or get involved in, and maybe they're back over there somewhere. And then it might be posted on the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society website. One resource that isn't there is if you are a student, you might meet Sue Schwick, who is in the English department and teaching a course this spring, the subtitle of which is about the Foundling Museum. And I'll try it. I get emotional easily. But the Foundling Museum is made from buttons and pieces of cloth that American Indian parents gave their, Sue can explain it better than me.
You're being very eloquent, but it's based on a museum in London. It's from the 17th century common hospital founded by Handel, where poor women, when they came, half of them sobbing because they were leaving their kids and the other half sobbing because they couldn't leave their kids.
Yeah.
And they weren't literate and they weren't bureaucratic forms, so they would leave a little scrap of cloth or a button or something in order to match with their child in the hope that they would come back. And there's this huge archive of these objects, and then the Foundling Museum has different people who the museum chooses, choose an object and then write an essay about it, and that's what your experience is going through the museum, of hearing people's voices about why they chose that object. So it's an American Cultures course in the spring. It's going to be called the American Foundling Museum, and it's exploring the history of family separation in the U.S., and everyone's going to be finding some kind of artifact to curate in a virtual museum space. So anyway, yeah, it's open in the spring.
Thank you for correcting me on something I'm not an expert on. I also want to thank Denise Bird, the Associate Director of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society, as well as Takia Franklin from HIFAS for organizing this, with Ericka Brown, who did a lot of this work, Deborah Lestig from the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine, and Aline Hara, who's been helping or was helping with getting questions.
I'd like to just say something. A lot of people, when they talk about immigration, are like, what can we do at the federal level? And I just want to say we haven't had immigration reform for decades. I've been part of 3 immigration reform efforts, and I think the whole idea of immigration reform is somewhat dated, and we have to think about it in a different way. But I just need everybody to know that, like, everything we've won at a federal level has always come from local power, whether we're shaping these narratives and telling a different story about what sanctuary means, what does it mean to belong, and who do we value in our communities, or just the undocumented and unafraid movement of undocumented students, including many students of this university, being able to tell those stories and really reclaim power and said, no, we belong here and we will stay here. And so there are a lot of opportunities to feel like, okay, something's at the border and we have to run to the border and fund these different organizations. It starts at the local level. We lack federal power because we have not grown as a movement locally around the country. And despite politicians saying the right things, they can always do more. For them to say, no, it's just a federal issue is not true. We know that people effectuate change and people in power can effectuate that change from our city all the way to the county, from county to federal. And so I would definitely connect with efforts. There's so many different efforts around detention reform, sanctuary, serving unaccompanied minors. We have a large population in this county. What does that look like for this county to actually welcome these young people and give them resources? And the school districts is another thing. So be creative and go out there and look for your local organizations, not just the mega organizations that might be talking about these issues, but not understanding how it plays out every single day.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We thank you for coming too and sharing your questions and your desires and wishes for a different society. Thank you for coming and spending time with us and for the work that you do and just for gracing us with your presence and your